Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to the University of Minnesota. Welcome to those of you joining us online here today. My name is Todd Reubold, and I'm with Ensia and the Institute on the Environment, the two hosts for today's event. Just a little bit about Ensia for those of you who might not know. We are a solutions-focused nonprofit publication housed within the University of Minnesota's Institute on the Environment, and we rigorously report on what's being done to respond to big environmental challenges. And so that focus on solutions is really important to us. Through our live events like the one we have here today, we hope to bring people together to discuss emerging environmental issues, to find common ground, we're hoping, throughout this discussion, and then also inspire you all to work towards a more sustainable future. So thank you to everyone for being here today. I want to ask you all a question before I bring up our speakers. How many of you think that in order to tackle really big, complex environmental challenges like, say, climate change, we're going to have to talk to and work with people we disagree with? Okay, for those of you online, nearly everybody raised their hand. Let me ask you a follow-up question then. How many people, myself included, have stopped talking to people we disagree with, whether they're friends, family members, or others, in the past couple of years? Okay, so about half of the audience raised their hand. That's the problem we have. We have to figure out how we're going to bridge those divides, and we're going to work together with one another. So hopefully starting today, myself included, we can take a step in that direction. A couple basic ground rules I just want to set out before I introduce and bring up our speakers here today. These are pretty contentious topics, I know that, so let's try to be respectful of one another. Also, I hope we can keep the conversation focused on science and environmental issues, although there are a lot of things we'd probably want to discuss. And then finally, when we get to the Q&A, you'll notice we have a microphone up front, so please feel free to come up to ask your questions. For those of you online, you can tweet us at Ensia Media, and we'll try to bring those questions into the conversation too. So it's now my pleasure to introduce both of our featured guests and kick off this conversation about finding common ground around critical science and environmental topics. So I'll invite both of you to join me up on stage here. So our first guest is Benji Backer. Benji is the president and founder of the American Conservation Coalition, a millennial-led national organization giving voice to college-age conservatives who care about the environment. He's spoken nationally at events all around the country, including the Conservative Political Action Conference in 2014 and 2016. Benji hopes that through ACC he can work to unite Americans on pro-environmental reforms and change the narrative when it comes to the environment. He's originally from Wisconsin, which we won't hold against him, and a Packers fan, I should note. He's currently a student at the University of Washington in Seattle. So please join me in welcoming Benji. Our other guest for the day that we're really excited to have with us here is Caroline Weinberg. Caroline is a New York City-based public health professional with a focus on reproductive health in adolescents. She's one of the co-founders of the March for Science, a global movement that brought together more than 1 million people in over 600 locations, or perhaps more than 600 locations, around the world in support of science in 2017. Since then, she's continued on as the interim executive director of the March for Science organization, a nonpartisan nonprofit that advocates for equitable, evidence-based policies and supports a global grassroots network of science advocates. Please join me in welcoming Caroline. So there's a microphone for both of you here. Before we dig into this big topic of finding ground on, common ground on science and environmental issues, I want to take a moment to have both of you look backwards a little bit to the origins of your belief systems, or what were those initial inspirations or influences in your life that led to your way of thinking around politics or some of the policy issues that you're working on nowadays. So Caroline, do you want to jump in first?
Sure. Thank you for having us, by the way. I grew up in New York City, so liberal New York City, but not just liberal, like one of the most liberal neighborhoods in liberal New York City. So I was very steeped in kind of those ideas as I was growing up, and I think that most of my politics are rooted in the concept of like justice and equality, the idea that healthcare should be a human right, and that women should have equal rights, and that all of these things are kind of basic fundamental things that I was raised with at home and in all of the people I was surrounded in. And then in terms of, I guess, like origin stories, how I like grew from there, I went to the University of Virginia for college, and growing up, I had like everyone I grew up with was basically had at least liberal social sensibilities, and so I had never had anyone confront the concept that abortion should be legal or that there should be gun control or things like that. And I'd never butted heads with anyone. I'd never had to really defend my beliefs. And when I went to college, that happened, and so that really taught me to think about my politics and my concepts before I just kind of ran off my mouth and like regurgitated what my parents had taught me. So that really changed things and made me kind of much more involved in the debate and the concepts behind politics. And then with the march, I was off work the morning that it went viral. So that kind of like went from there.
Benji, how about the early influences for you?
Yeah, so I grew up in a family of entrepreneurs. My parents started a business when I was in elementary school during the recession. And so seeing kind of the government red tape that was there for businesses was pretty instrumental in getting my fiscal conservative values. I've always thought of myself to be pretty socially moderate, so that really never played into where I stand politically. But the fiscal issues came from kind of that background and just kind of stretching every penny and every dollar. And when I was 12, I decided to get active in political campaigns because I felt so passionately about my viewpoints. So I've been active in politics since then and interested since I was 10. So I've been active for a while, and it just kind of came from my parents being entrepreneurs. And then for the environment, my family and I, we would go on vacations to natural areas, and so I just grew up loving hiking and skiing and other outdoor activities. And I was just telling you this morning, I when choosing a college, I was trying to figure out where I could go that I could hike and ski. Usually people are like, oh, where's the best school for me? But I was like, where can I hike and ski and also go to school? So that's kind of how I picked the University of Washington, but that's how big of an influence it is for me, the environment.
I can totally support that decision, so I'm right there with you. So I want to ask you both about the organizations that you've started, the March for Science and the American Conservation Coalition. What was the initial spark? What was that moment like when you said, I've got to start this, I've got to do this with my life? And then also, where are you at right now with the organizations? What are you hoping to accomplish moving forward?
Yeah, so going back to me being active in politics since I was 12, I've gotten to meet a lot of young conservatives. I'm 20 now, and so I've been active for over 8 years in the political world. And there are so many young conservatives that care about the environment, and they actually put it at the top of the totem pole, but they just don't even know how to talk about it, or they think that they're liberal on that issue. And so I'd always ask myself when people would tell me that they were liberal on the environment, I'd always say, well, why is it liberal to care about the environment right now? Why is that like just a partisan thing? And for somebody who cares about it so much, I noticed there was a huge gap in the conservative movement, and that there really wasn't an organization out there fighting for environmental values on the conservative side from viewpoints that conservatives could also get behind and help them better understand where to come from. So that's where the idea came from. Our organization is on over 80 college campuses nationwide. We have chair people on over 80 college campuses. It was launched 1.5 years ago, and we help kind of prioritize this issue within the conservative movement and make sure that Republicans who are elected to office realize that their constituents care about these issues. It's not just the liberal constituents that care, and try to make this conversation far more bipartisan by bringing conservative voices into the fold through events like this and opportunities with legislators and activism drives where we partner with college Republicans and young Democrats and try to get a lot of support behind it. So we're youth focused, but we also do things on Capitol Hill and work with other demographics as well.
Before Caroline jumps in to answer this question for the March for Science, a quick follow-up. Do you feel like there's a home for young conservatives who care about the environment within the modern Republican Party? What has the response been to the work you guys are trying to do, you're all trying to do?
Yeah, I think there is a home. There are certain voices that are doing a pretty good job of putting this issue on a priority list. There are a handful in Congress that are actually doing a lot of great things on the environment, but because the conservative movement doesn't prioritize the environment, we don't hear about it. in our constituencies or in the media. So partially what we need to do better, and within our organization need to do better, is getting the notion out there that there are conservatives leading on these issues. It might not be all of the top leaders in the movement, but there are a lot of elected officials that are. There are also constituencies within the Republican Party that are damaging in the environmental community. There's no doubt about that. And so there are a lot of Republicans that are young and feel lost on these issues. But it's a matter of helping them realize that there are some that are out there that are good too, and making that a larger faction of the party.
So Caroline, if you want to talk a little bit about the origins of the March for Science and what was that like?
So I'm not 20, and I had always been involved in kind of community intervention and organizing, but never on a kind of advocacy policy level, and definitely not on the scale of the march. And I actually was having a conversation with a friend of mine who works for the government in like communicating climate change findings, and had been told, got a memo to her office that was one after Trump was elected that was like, you can't do this anymore. And I got very agitated, as one does. And I was talking with my friend and was kind of like, we should march for science. And I was very cocksure of myself, and in what will definitely be on my tombstone was like, oh, it'll be really easy. I'll just like get a bunch of colleges on board. It'll be fine. It'll just plan itself, which it did not. But but my like original concept of it was marching in Washington. And then and I became the national co-chair and was the organizer of that, but through really no effort of our own, it just spread. As soon as it was announced that it was happening, people were popping up all over the place. I'm going to do this in San Francisco. I'm going to do this in London. I'm going to do this everywhere. And it just spread like wildfire. And then it just continued to grow. And then we ended up in more than 600 locations. And it was just mind-blowing, the international response to it. And I said this to you before, but there were over 1 million people marching, and also 5 penguins at the Monterey Bay Aquarium. You should Google it. It's amazing. Like, march through the halls of the aquarium. Huge fan. Anyway, so what it was initially spawned kind of undeniably by fear and concern around what was happening with the incoming administration. But the more I thought about it, the reality is that anti-science rhetoric has been around for long before Trump. Like, we could have had this march 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, and making it out as though Trump is like the boogeyman who created all of this anti-science stuff is giving him too much credit and letting too many other people off the hook. So what we really began focusing on is, and we started as nonpartisan and we've stayed with that, and what our focus is as an organization is bringing together scientists and non-scientists to advocate for equitable evidence-based policies, just kind of for the common good. And that's what we've emphasized, and what we've found as we survey our like members and supporters is that 30% of our supporters self-identify as scientists, and everyone else is a non-scientist. They work in a science-adjacent field. They think science is awesome, which it is. They are concerned about policies, whatever it is. They're not scientists. And so that kind of breadth of support, showing that it's not just scientists as like a special interest group that are advocating for these policies, has really been the thrust of what we're working on.
Over breakfast, we were talking about how within the office that I work here at the University of Minnesota, when we first heard about the March for Science, some people were saying, oh no, what are they doing politicizing science? That's a mistake. You said that that's something that's a critique you heard from others too. Yeah. What's your response, or what is your response to that?
When the march initially went viral and really just exploded in the course of a couple of hours, people didn't really know what we were about, so they assumed that it was just like a standard kind of anti-Trump, anti-conservative protest, and they were like, oh, you're making this too political. And we gradually over time managed to convince a lot of people accurately that it was nonpartisan and it wasn't about one party or the other. It was about holding everyone accountable. But there was still that thread of people thinking that they would like lose their objectivity as scientists if they got involved in politics. But the reality is, whether you want it to be or not, science is political. Everything about it. I mean, we want science in policy. We want it in environmental policy. It should be involved when we talk about transportation, when we talk about healthcare, when we talk about housing. Like, science should be in policy. And politics influences science. Funding influences who gets to do science, who science is conducted on, what science we learn about. It's inextricably linked. And there are studies that show that the general public believes in like want science and policy, and they trust scientists, and we need to just kind of accept that and get past the idea that scientists should be quiet. Because if you do this really cool research and you discover something amazing that should be influencing the world around you, and you don't advocate for it to actually be applied, like, what are you doing the research for? Like, if you find out something amazing that can change the world, you have to fight for it to influence policy. And kind of, I think the March for Science helped move that forward, which, yeah.
It was interesting to hear also over breakfast that Benji, you attended the March for Science. So
Yeah.
what was your reaction to the march, and what were your impressions?
Yeah, so I was telling you guys this morning, I was probably the only conservative at the March for Science in DC, and I even thought for a while about just kind of not telling anybody that I went, because there's just kind of a stigma around that where I think both sides are to blame. You know, when I told conservatives I went to the March for Science, they're like, "Oh, you're washed up, man," and you rhino.
We were happy to have you.
You rhino. And the left was like, you know, how can you be a conservative and be here? You know, how can you support those ideals and also support this? And I would say that even though the organization wasn't politicizing it, the people who were there were politicizing it. And if they would have known that I was a conservative, it would have not been good. And so I definitely like kept myself on that, and I was just there to support the fact that I care about the environment, that there needs to be action taken. But I think that that's kind of an underlying problem with the environmental movement, is that it is so partisan that people often forget that there are conservatives who care about it, and just because you feel like Donald Trump or somebody else doesn't care about it doesn't mean the entire population, 50% of the American population, doesn't care about it. So that's something that's really easy to forget, or it seems like it's easier to forget. But it kind of woke me up to the partisan side of this movement, the environmental movement, because as a conservative, and I didn't even say that I was a conservative there, I still did not feel welcome, and I feel like I'm a pretty rational conservative, so that's a problem.
I think also part of it is that we need to start drawing a distinction between Republican, conservative, liberal, Democrat, like the politicians who have the platforms on it, and the actual people who are part of that party, because there's a really distinct difference, and we tend to kind of paint everyone with the same brush, and that's part of how we ended up in this mess.
We were also chatting about this earlier. Is there room for moderates in this discussion or not? I mean, we're so polarized by the extremes right now. What do you both think? Is there room for a Republican or moderate Democrats, if you will, or yeah? What do you both think?
I'd say it's really tough right now to be a moderate in either camp. I think that there's a big problem that both sides kind of say that if you're not 100% with us, you're against us. And you see a lot of the credibility of moderates just dropping off in each party, and they're not taken seriously. They're getting primaried, they're getting voted out, or they're just retiring because they realize that they can't handle being a moderate in elected office. I don't know if that's temporary or not. I really don't. I think really long term that it'll change, but I don't know how long this is going to last, this partisan divide. There's really no place right now for moderates, which is sad. And the more that is happening, the more are leaving these discussions. And so as a result, we're just getting crazier and crazier people elected to office. So I think as like a voting population, people need to realize that that's not the answer. It's the voters who are making this happen. And Republicans need to realize that just because someone doesn't agree with you 100% of the time, that doesn't make them evil. And just because you're a Democrat and your Democratic representative doesn't agree with you 100% of the time, that also doesn't make them evil. And we have these crazy stereotypes that, yeah, there's like 20% of us that think that moderates are great, or that we, having both sides work together, but the bases are the ones who determine the outcome of these elections, and the bases right now want people who agree with their liberal or conservative values 100% of the time. I think that's really dangerous, and it's shooing out all of the moderates, and I don't know if that's temporary or not, but I'm hoping that it is temporary.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of that. I think that there's there's really no space for moderates right now, because I think part of it is because people are so passionate and angry and in some cases hopeful, whatever, about or excited about what's happening right now, that they're like so full into it that it's hard, the idea that there would be wiggle room for anyone who doesn't perfectly align with your values, which makes it challenging for anyone to be a moderate. But I do think that being a moderate, or at least being someone who is on one side of the spectrum but is willing to kind of meet in the moderate ground with someone on the opposite side of the spectrum, is the only way we can move forward. Because right now it's just, there's no possibility for cooperating, because everybody knows that they'll only get reelected if they stick with like every single policy on one side or the other. And so it's made things tricky.
One more thing there is that you need moderates and radicals in office. You need moderates and strong conservatives, and moderates and strong liberals. And the argument that you hear, like with Bernie or Trump, is that people say, oh, well, if we didn't have a radical like blank during the history event of 19 whatever, we wouldn't have ever had a revolution on blank. And yeah, that's true, but also if we would have always had radicals in charge, it wouldn't be great either. So like, you need to have both factions elected, and if you just have strong conservatives and strong liberals in office, that's not a good thing.
I want to switch gears here a little bit and ask you both about the role of social media. As we were also discussing earlier, we've all, and I will raise my hand to this too, said things we probably regret on social media. And so I'm wondering, how do you balance that personal versus professional presence on social media, especially when you're both trying to run organizations or are running organizations that are trying to bring people together, trying to bring people more into these conversations? So how do you balance that? And then perhaps the follow-up to that question, what do you think about the role of social media in this divide we're seeing in the country right now?
So I joined Twitter while it was still in beta. Like @Caroline was still available, but I thought it was going to flop, so I chose like my 6th grade AOL screen name instead. And the big mistake. But like I helped start a global movement on social media, and at the time I think I had tweeted like 50 times. I have been part of this movement for a year and a half, and I still have like 400 followers. So my personal social media is not. I haven't said anything I regretted yet, though I'm sure that'll like change, and this will be a famous last words video. But I have gotten kind of slightly more political recently, but in terms of social media. But for me, and I'm also kind of inept at it, but on a large scale, social media was entirely responsible for how the March for Science happened. We went from 50 followers on a Twitter handle to like 50,000 in 5 hours, and 100 likes on Facebook to 200,000 in a day. I mean, it was insane how it spread, and it could not have happened otherwise, and we couldn't have managed it. And I don't know. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Why do you think that was? I'm just really curious.
I think it's because, so first it took off right after the Women's March, so people were like primed to be kind of taking on the next thing. So that was part of it. I also think that the nature of social media is that it's just this web, and people start talking about it, and it just spreads, and and then it jumps to traditional media. Like, we had gone viral, and then 5 hours later, I was fielding a call from the Washington Post. Like, it got picked up very quickly, and that allowed us to stay relevant and spread. And it's still a lot. Social media is still our largest platform, and probably always will be. I mean, when we advocate around an issue and we spread it on Facebook and Twitter, thousands of people reach out. We did a week of action last month, and 18,000 messages were sent to politicians around science issues, and it was entirely through social media. But I do also think that it's really easy to step in it in social media, and that was a painful lesson that we learned a lot. And it's hard to tell the difference between people who are like irrationally mad at you and people who are making totally valid criticisms that you then need to address, because everything gets all kind of mixed in. So social media it's really challenging to do well, and there's a reason that people are like professional social media people, because it's a skill. So I think that the spread of information through social media is the way that we're going to keep people galvanized long into the future. We wouldn't exist without it.
Benji, what do you think of this topic of social media? How does it play into the work you're doing, but also personally and professionally, how you're using it?
Yeah, so when I started in politics, I was just making phone calls for campaigns. And then I started tweeting about my opinions, and people were like, oh, wow, like a 12-year-old talking about, like, the Federal Reserve. That's weird. And so, but I would not be here if it wasn't for social media. And kind of that gave me the start when I was young. It's how I've met most of the team members on our organization, because we have team members in 20 plus different states, and a lot of them came from social media connections. Then I ended up meeting them in person later on, but it's a very valuable tool, and it's also very valuable for education and advocacy and getting the word out there. You can get to people so much faster than you can through even something like email or everything prior to that. So I think that that's really valuable, but on the flip side, there are a lot of negatives to it. People get so caught up in that, and that's where they trust the news. People talk about fake news in terms of like CNN and Fox News or whatever, depending on where you lie. But there's far more fake news or inaccurate news and facts on social media than in these journal sites or whatever. But people, especially in our generation, trust social media more than they do like CNN or Fox News. And not that those are two good alternatives, but it's kind of dangerous. And so I think that it's really easy to spread misinformation on social media, and it's obviously really easy to say things that are wrong or that you didn't mean. And you can see people's history from a decade ago, since social media was there, and a lot happens within that time frame. So there are a lot of issues with it, but I think if it's used right, it's a very valuable tool, especially in the environmental movement. There are so many different issues that people need to know about, and a lot of them, especially with Congress, happen on a day-to-day basis that people need to know right away, and social media is a really good way to update people.
Just with regards to misinformation, I'd say that to me is also the scariest part of social media. Like if a well-crafted tweet that is complete nonsense gets out there and goes viral, there's no putting it back in the bottle. Right. And that's a really, really scary part of social media that probably explains why I stay out of it. But yeah.
Benji, I want to ask you about something you and I were talking about on a phone call before this event here today about how do you connect or how do you talk to conservatives about climate change? And you said to me that you need to talk about conservatives. The way you talk to conservatives about climate change is you don't talk about climate change. Can you explain what you meant by that? And then also, with the recent IPCC report that just came out, there's this urgency to do something. Do we have time to worry about the semantics of how we talk about these issues? So how do we connect with conservatives around this issue?
Yeah, so to answer the first part of the question, the topic of climate change and global warming has been around for decades, and it's no secret that most conservatives are older. And that's kind of it's a cycle. It's not like people are like, oh, conservatives are just going to die off. And it's like, all right, that's a really bad way of looking at it, and also just not true. But they've been around to see in the 1980s and 90s these reports that said, oh, we're going to be out of water by 2010, or we're going to, the world's going to end by 2010. And they just had all these different standards that never came true. And so they are really doubtful of the science, and not that everything's been wrong. There have been a lot of things that have been right, but they see kind of those alarmist facts that were presented decades ago, and then they see the ones that are being told today, and they draw a parallel, and understandably so. So I think what needs to happen is, when talking about climate change and other environmental issues, you have to talk about it with things that are tangible to them. And there is time to figure it out, because you can talk about clean energy and reducing emissions and helping out businesses, which is great for conservatives. Conservatives love that, and still be curbing climate change at the same time. So you can talk about clean energy, conservation, and then how businesses can be involved in, and how the economy can still boom with environmental protection. And none of that includes climate change, but it all has a positive effect on said climate change. So I think that's how people need to approach it. You are not going to convince the conservatives that doubt climate change, that climate change is going to kill us all by 2040, or have a serious effect. And I think it's fair for people to have doubts of that because they've seen so many false reports in their lives. So I think we just need to attack it from a different perspective, which is more of an economic-based perspective, while throwing in environmental problems as well.
I'm going to ask you about a carbon tax in just a minute here. We'll come back to that in a second. But first, Caroline, I want to ask you, what do you think when you hear this statement that we have the science say on climate change, but the science is not enough to convince people that action needs to be taken? What are we missing there? What are we doing wrong in conveying that science, I guess?
I think we're missing the story aspect of it. It's hard for people who aren't steeped in the science to understand the broad concept. Like, yes, the temperature is getting higher, and I understand the change in the thermometer, but what does that actually mean for me? Yes, the water level is rising, but how does that affect me? And I think that scientists as a whole have done not so as a large. There are some scientists who are absolutely phenomenal at this and who are really the reason that we're not completely lost at the moment. But in general, really need to pivot from talking about things in the big picture to talking to people about how climate change impacts them directly. So, I mean, we were talking about this before, but it's not, the picture of an emaciated polar bear is very disturbing, and it mobilizes people to like be upset and think that climate change is real. But if you want people to potentially think that climate change is real. But if you want people to take action, you need to talk to them about how that water level rise is going to impact you, and how does the warming influence like your home, and how does how is the air that your children breathe going to change, and things like that. So we really need to pivot to having a more personal conversation about climate change rather than a big picture one, so that scientists kind of get out of the numbers game and instead tell the story, which is science communication. And for scientists who aren't good at it, which is totally fine. It's a skill that can be learned, but not everyone can learn it. There are people who do this professionally. So science communicators are kind of our best hope at changing things, because they have the knowledge and they can help us communicate it in a way that leads to change.
I want to open it up for questions in just a moment here. So we do have a microphone set up front if you'd like to come up front to ask your questions on the right side. If you're on the left side of the room and you don't want to walk across the stage, just raise your hand and I'll come on up and get your question. We want to have the microphone for questions, though, so that our online audience can hear the questions also. So be thinking of your questions. I'm going to come to all of you in just a second here. But Benji, let's talk about the carbon tax. Where do you stand? Where do most of your conservative friends stand? What's the potential for a carbon tax?
So that's a tough question, and it's kind of been engulfing every environmental discussion. So before I go to that, I kind of want to talk about something that's very similar, and that is going back to the original question about where climate change is in the conservative movement. Most conservatives are seen to not care about the environment because they're so disenfranchised by the climate change discussion that they completely separate themselves from any environmental conversation at all. So then they're not a part of the clean air, clean water, public lands, wildlife discussions, and that's really damaging. And then they're thrown into this camp that they don't care about the environment. And I know so many climate change hoaxers who think that it's a hoax, and they want clean air, and they want clean water, and they want safe communities that are free from that. So it's a matter of incorporating them at the very least in those conversations and helping them understand that just because they don't believe in climate change doesn't mean they can't be involved in these discussions. And if they're involved in them, maybe they'll be more open to being a part of a climate change discussion. So I think that's something we need to separate. So then that leads into the carbon tax question. You are not going to get conservatives into the climate change discussion by advocating for a tax. That is like going to the liberal movement and asking them to be pro-life. I mean, that's just like, it's a staple of the conservative movement is low taxes or no taxes, right? That is just something that conservatives put. I mean, that's why so many people are conservative. So you're telling people to give up their values for an issue just because that's the proposal that's on the table. So I personally do not think that a carbon tax is feasible with how conservatives view the world and how they view economics. And there are conservatives who are on board. I'm well aware of that. And I know many of them and respect all of them. But I don't think as a movement that's going to change. Maybe it will with my generation. I'm not sure. But it still is a staple of the conservative value set. And also, like for example, in Washington State, where I was for my freshman year, I'm a junior now, but during my freshman year, they were trying to pass a revenue-neutral carbon tax. Like all the top Republican officials from the past few decades were on board with it, and it was something where almost seemed like most Republicans actually ended up voting for it. I think it's a different state, so I don't think you can kind of attribute that to the rest of the country. But the Democrats came out against it because they didn't like where the money went. They didn't like the fact that it went back to the taxpayers and it didn't go to the government, and so they don't have a carbon tax now. And they had a chance to work with Republicans to get a carbon tax passed and have it in immense bipartisan success, and then be able to say to the rest of the country, hey, look what we did. But they couldn't even do that because they couldn't set aside where the money goes. And now they're trying to pass one right now where they have billions flowing into the state government. They don't even know where they're going to have it allocated, and now all the Republicans are against it in Washington State when they were for it in 2016. So I think that that's a problem, and if there's not a place for revenue neutral carbon tax in Washington State, then I don't think that there is anywhere in the country. There are other ways to approach carbon emissions reduction than through a carbon tax that are better for the economy and better for conservatives to get on board and less intrusive. There's clean tax cuts. There's tons of ideas kind of in that same vein where you lower taxes on businesses like coal and oil companies and other companies who are reducing their emissions through clean energy. That's a really easy sell to a lot of conservatives, and there are a lot of other proposals kind of in that same vein where it's more of an incentivized approach rather than a punishment. And businesses are already doing it in the United States. We're reducing emissions more than any country by numbers each year over the past couple of years. And that's because businesses are going green and they're cutting their emissions, and because it's economically sustainable and it's environmentally sustainable and it's demanded by us, the consumer. So I think that businesses are going to be the future of this in a lot of ways, and you're seeing a lot of great steps, not only from tech companies and other companies that can afford to do it, but even Exxon and BP and oil companies that are completely changing their energy portfolio to be more green, and it's cutting emissions by an immense number. And the last thing I'll say is that there are a lot of great technologies out there, like carbon sequestration and carbon scrubbing and other things that you're able to use as an oil company or as a coal company that they're using to lower emissions, which is pretty exciting. So I think those are the types of things that the future is going to be around. I don't think that a carbon tax politically is going to have any future, at least right now.
I'm going to open it up for questions, so if anyone wants to raise a hand, I'll come around or jump on up to the microphone here too if you want to. That'd be great.
Okay, so you talked a lot about, the tax issue, and I get that nobody wants new taxes. It's a very unpolitical idea, but we've been subsidizing energy for decades, forever. How about we switch that conversation up a little bit and say, all right, we will keep some subsidies, but it needs to be on clean energy. And the rest of you, no more subsidies for you. It's time to move on. Would that kind of conversation help? And how can we spur that kind of conversation?
Yeah, so I don't know if you could convince conservatives to be okay with subsidies in one area of energy and not the other. I do think that it would benefit clean energy to have like either no subsidies on any of the energy sectors except for on like research and development and on new like innovations within the industry like any other industry. Clean energy should be able to compete with oil and coal and others, but they're also being propped up. And they shouldn't be propped up. The oil and coal companies are being propped up, and that has hurt the clean energy sector. So I think what needs to happen is it needs to be an even level playing field. And because it hasn't been, it's actually, I think, hurt clean energy and clean energy development. And it also incentivizes those companies to keep improving because they're on an even level playing field. That's something that conservatives can get behind. And when talking to conservative leadership, that's something that they want to prioritize is making it more of an even level playing field for different energy sectors, and that they'll be able to compete with one another and keep innovating because clean energy can compete right now. And then using incentives and other things for new industries or new innovations that are coming up and kind of need it. So I think that there's a combination of that. Again, I think it'd be a little bit hard to say, okay, no subsidies on oil and coal, but subsidies on all clean energy. I think that'd be really hard for conservatives to get behind. But I also think that a lot of clean energy, like I said, clean energy sectors have had a tough time growing because they've had red tape. I mean, nuclear and solar and wind and all these different clean energy different sectors have had different barriers that they've had to climb over, and they've also had to fight the incentives and subsidies that the oil and gas industry gets. So I think that there's a combination of an answer there.
Caroline, do you want to weigh in at all before we go to the next question?
I think just that at a certain point we're going to have to decide, and by we I mean politicians, well, us too because we vote, but where kind of priorities lie, and we're just going to need to bite the proverbial bullet and say, okay, we are just giving money to clean energy, and it's not, and I recognize at the same time that it's a hard sell, and maybe that's why we haven't done it yet. But I think that we could continue on the path we're on forever with the argument that everything has to be equal, and at a certain point we're just going to have to be like, okay, equal's not working, let's start really incentivizing what's going to kind of save the future. So
I don't think things are equal right now, which I think is part of the problem. I don't think we've seen what it is like when it is equal in terms of energy.
Subsidizing both.
Yeah, but they're not equal subsidies.
But they're so not exactly equal. But I mean, we are subsidizing coal.
Right, but if you look, I was just reading today from the Energy Industry Association, the coal and oil are the top subsidized in terms of dollars out of anything, and percentage-wise, it depends on the industry. But we haven't seen an even level playing field, and I don't think that would be a negative thing. I think the research is showing that clean energy can compete way more than people thinks it can. So I think that that's really a key thing moving forward. And the other thing is that you have to remember that oil plays, it sounds really bad, but it plays an important role in our country right now. And we have to keep that in the back of our minds. The consumer, if we don't, consumers, especially lower to middle class Americans, need cheap, affordable energy. And right now that's oil. And that's going to change, but that's just the fact of the matter right now. And so we need to make sure that that's kind of part of our decision making and keeping things easier for lower to middle class Americans, and also understanding that a lot of these oil companies are doing a pretty good job of lowering their emissions. I mean, I did a tour. I went to Texas to tour some oil fields, and I went in there thinking kind of oil's the enemy to my environmental cares. And I was seeing what a lot of these companies are doing to lessen the emissions from their flares, and it's made an immense impact. So I think it's obviously not perfect, and it's far less environmentally beneficial than clean energy, but they are making strides, and it's still part of our energy portfolio.
But wouldn't that change happen faster if we pushed money into it? The reason that we can't right now get rid of gas, right? Because that is the most affordable. The cars are cheaper, gas is cheap. Not everyone has a plug in their the plug that can charge a car in their house. We can't get away from it. But if we shoved more money into clean energy, relentlessly, and decided that was what the commitment was going to be, then perhaps it could be more affordable, and then people wouldn't be reliant on gas. I don't think we can get rid of gas right away because we run on it. I mean, the country relies on it. But that doesn't mean that shift. I just think the shift that you're talking about will happen a lot faster if we.
I'm going to go grab another question here.
Oh, sorry.
We could talk all hour about subsidies.
We'll talk later.
Question up here in the middle.
So I'm kind of in a tight spot that I think is becoming more common, where I come from a very strongly conservative family, but my other half is very strongly and vocally liberal, and they're both extremely vocal on social media. And I'm an environmental engineer graduate student here, so I'm the scientist in the group, and of course that means I get, well, Megan, you know about this. Tell me that I'm right. And so I just my solution right now is to just not say anything unless it's a really egregious, the YouTube scientists kind of just stuff that is just totally wrong. I'll respond to that. But otherwise I don't say anything. But with the holidays coming up, I don't know that I can get away with that. So with the theme of common ground here, coming as both as a conservative and more of a liberal kind of but scientist standpoint, how do you guys deal with talking across the aisle where you don't have to stop talking to your family,
Yeah.
but you stand up for yourself as well?
So I have a lot of conservative family members. My grandfather was like a diehard Trump supporter, and I definitely was not as diplomatic with him as I probably should have been with a 96-year-old. There was a lot. There was a fair amount of screaming when we would be in the same room, but I think that. I've kind of come to the conclusion that just talking about the science is never going to be enough, because people just don't get it and they'll dismiss it and whatever it is. So I really think that it's about, sometimes you just have to avoid the topic. Like sometimes it's just not worth it. I have found that a lot. Like my family Thanksgiving is like a no politics thing. My cousin's getting married right before the wedding, and I was like, you need to have like a no politics sign at the like ceremony, because otherwise all is going to be lost. But I think that figuring out where you can find common ground and just zeroing in on that as the topic that you discuss, like whether it's, if they live in a coastal community, talking about how like the water might be changing, like water levels might be changing things, or if they live in a place where there's wildfires, talking about that. Like if you can talk about the kind of science and politics of it in a way that is going to connect with people in their everyday lives, I think is really the only way to do it. Or like, talk about television shows. We do that a lot.
Yeah, I would say like my family's very divided too. I've got close family members who are the polar opposite of me, and then I've got close family members who are far more conservative than I am. So it definitely is a problem. I would say, like, a good question for the room is how many times have you actually convinced a family member that your opinion is right when you're arguing?
Once.
Wow. I need to take some lessons from you.
Only once.
But it doesn't really happen. Like, arguing at Thanksgiving about politics or really any holiday just ruins things, and you're never going to change anybody's mind. You can obviously, like, if someone's looking for policy information and they don't know where they stand on something, that's a great time to talk about politics with family. But, like, there's no reason to go at it with your family about politics. It just ruins the mood, and it ruins the experience. And so I usually try to avoid it, because I know I'm not going to change their mind. They are not going to change my mind, and that's what it really should come down to. So what's the point? If you are going to talk about politics, I would suggest choosing an issue like the environment where it's not X or Y. Like I was just saying, people who are pro-oil and coal and think that climate change is a hoax still think that the environment is important, despite what you might think. They do. And so having that discussion about different approaches and where they see the different approaches can be beneficial, because at least you know that they care and they know you care about the same thing. Whereas, like, if you're talking about abortion or immigration or something, you guys might have an X or Y, like, completely different viewpoint and different sets of solutions. And that's where the problems are usually found in terms of debate. Whereas, like, you and I could argue all day about subsidies, but we're not going to be throwing fists at each other. If we were talking about immigration or abortion, it could be way more heated, right? So I would suggest talking about an issue like the environment, where it's just like a lot easier to talk about the solutions because you agree on the problem. But still talking about it, I don't know if it's necessary.
Other question here in the middle.
So I'm going to argue with you on this. No, I'm just kidding. But I hear what you're saying and agree. On Thanksgiving, I'm not going to talk with my in-laws about politics. but I fundamentally actually think that's a problem. I think the fact that we don't learn how to talk about issues that we disagree about means that forevermore we'll not be talking about politics at Thanksgiving. So I'm curious, a bigger picture on this topic of how do we learn to have these conversations so that we're not, our kids are not talking to us, right?
Yeah.
And the fact of the matter is it's a privilege for us to not talk about them too. And so I
Right.
kind of keep that in mind as well, that not everyone has the privilege to not have conversations because they have to deal with things on a daily basis. So how can we move beyond that.
And not all topics can be avoided, right? Because sometimes if it's what you do professionally, if it's something that is so steeped in who you are as a human being, like you can't always avoid it. And I don't always think that you should. I think that there's, so like with family members, like I have a very good friend who's a conservative. And I've been friends with her for a really long time, and when we go out to dinner, we, have a conversation, we talk about our lives, but we also usually choose, like there's a political topic that we know we're gonna go into it and butt heads about and like have a conversation about, and I always learn new things. And then when we walk away and, hug and everything's fine. So I think part of it is knowing that when you go into the conversation, that it's not going to end in a way where the family member is like, I'm writing you out of the will and unfriending you on Facebook. Two equally serious things, I guess. But like, really taking a stand. But so I think that's part of it, is having that recognition that you can have that conversation and like still be family. But then also sometimes you can't. Like there are some people who I disagree with on such a fundamental level that I just have to accept that I can't speak with them. And while that's a horrible thing to say and it makes me feel like a terrible person, because I understand that you should like be able to find common ground with everyone, and that's true, you always can find common ground. But there's some people where I know that no matter what happens, I cannot have this conversation with them because I won't be able to interact with them, and you have to know when that's the case. And there are both groups of people. And yes, it is a complete luxury to know that I can do that like I can have a totally friendly conversation with like my uncle and my grandfather and just not talk about that. And that when we do get in that fight, at the end of the day, like things will kind of be okay. But I also know that there are people where, I have the luxury that I can just avoid those interactions. And so I do think that's important. But I think that one of the things that we need to be teaching kids, like in school, is to have those conversations, because the stereotype, like right before Thanksgiving or Christmas, whatever, there's always these articles that are like how to avoid politics at your family Thanksgiving, or things like that, and then on Twitter people are always like, well, just don't go, and things like that. But that's not the solution. And teaching from a young age how to argue and have those, not just argue but like debate and have those conversations, is really important. And I think that we need to teach people how to fundamentally disagree, but kind of move on and have those debates, because avoiding it is not always an option.
Yeah, and I guess what I was referring to mostly was like on Thanksgiving and Christmas, not having those discussions. Like if you're sitting at your house and you want to talk to your in-laws who are over for the weekend about it, that's a different story. Like I think having a huge argument at Thanksgiving when it's supposed to be this great family time, or Christmas, just is not worth it. I think that there are but most of the time having a dialogue with your family and other people is really important about these things, so they do understand how you feel, even though you're still probably not going to change their minds, just so they have an idea of what you stand for and why. I just think that there are certain times when it's best to table those conversations, and like at a huge family gathering, I think that's a perfect example of a time where you probably don't want to get into a huge argument, but that doesn't mean you can't talk to those people about it in general. I would say that the best way to approach these issues is not on the premise that you're going to debate them or argue their point or your point to them after you get upset, but understanding where they come from, hearing out what they believe and why, and then responding with your own opinion and why you believe that. A perfect example of this is for like conservatives who go to college. They sit and they listen to different opinions for almost the entirety of their 4 years, no matter where they go to school. And I've done that the last 3 years, and even in high school it was the case. And I've understood a lot better where liberals come from now, because I just sat there and I was able to hear their viewpoints and why. And even though I don't agree with it, I'm able to understand it. And I think you can take that same concept to your family and your friends, and just sitting there and listening to what they believe. And just because you don't believe it, so what? Just take it in, and maybe you'll have a better perspective of where they stand, and then you do the same to them, and maybe they'll have a better perspective too. But I think it helps open your mind. And I think where the problem lies in America right now is that most people think that their way is the only way, and that their way is the only right way, because they don't understand the other side. And when you're arguing and you're like basically shouting at each other, you're not understanding the other person's side. And I think that that's where the problem lies.
Geez, now I feel bad about unfriending family members on Facebook. You guys are better than
You
I
can
am.
just mute them.
That's right. I think we have time for one more audience question, and while I'm coming up here to get the question, quick one for both of you. Oh, over here. Okay. 2 more questions then. One more quick question for both of you in just a sentence or two. You're both reasonable, rational individuals.
When there's a camera on.
With the camera on. Would you run for political office?
No. There's just, and I think that's a problem. Like when I was younger, I thought that was a really exciting thing that I might want to think about. There's an interview of 12-year-old me saying that I'm going to run for office. But it's just too polarizing, and rational people aren't taking that seriously right now. Hopefully that will change.
Absolutely not. I mean, first of all, I like to see kind of more of an immediate impact than politics allows you to, because things are kind of a long haul. And also, I just don't think I have the I don't think I have the ability to sustain that diplomacy when I feel like I'm being really not being able to move forward. I'm hopeful that we can elect great people who'd be in the job. I am not a born politician.
Interesting. That might be a whole nother discussion. Okay,
Yeah,
we'll go to the
seriously.
mic here, and then I'm going
You're
to
a
go up here
therapist?
for one more question, but go ahead.
Yeah. Unlike abortion and like immigration, environmental issues don't really have a storyline. How would you classify the values of people fighting against environmental protection?
Yeah, I actually think a lot of people who are fighting against environmental protection do have a storyline. Like people who are in lower class communities suffer more than upper class communities with the environment. And as a conservative, that's a really hard point to get across to a lot of people. And I didn't think that was the case until I saw it firsthand through some of the research and experiences that I was able to do. And it's really hard to explain to people because like, how? Like they all live in places that are near the coasts or, in places that are affected by the environment. How could it change? Well, lower class people can't afford to just move elsewhere, or lower class people can't just like buy new things, or whatever it may be. There's a difference between like where the lower class and upper class come from on these issues. I think that's a storyline. Other than that, you're right though. I think that it's hard to classify that, but I also think that that's what makes it a little bit easier to discuss with other people, because other than the lower upper class communities, it's not like emotionally hitting them like it is with immigration and abortion, which is why I'm hopeful that the environment can be a bridging issue for both sides and that we can actually accomplish things because it isn't so emotional compared to other issues. Which is why I think most people should prioritize it at a higher level because there's an opportunity there, whereas other issues, it's an uphill battle.
I would just say that I think in a lot of times, I don't think there are a lot of people who are anti-environment as a whole, but more like anti kind of the policies around it. And I think a lot of the times it comes down to economy and jobs. They think clean energy is going to steal jobs. They think they're going to be, it's going to impact their way of life. It's going to make their living more expensive, things like that. And I think that focusing on that as the narrative and pushing back against how clean energy improves the economy and things like that is the way to do it. I think it's, at least based on my experience talking, it's less about a value system than their concern. And this is completely valid, like that they're concerned about their own personal future in things like that. And so it's hard to kind of move past that. And so I think that's the narrative you go for.
Yeah, one more thing on that is that like people in coal and oil communities, that's their job, that's their livelihoods. We need to understand that too. And like on the flip side, talking about the lower class communities that are affected by the environment, there's also lower class people who work in those industries that rely on that to be successful, and they need to be, helped if that industry is going to go, like if coal ends up, kind of going away in the next few decades, they are going to need help because they're going to need places to be. So I think that's something to think about, that there's different sides to this, and most people are just anti-policy, not anti-environment.
Yeah. Also, I'm sorry, the one other thing I'd say is that a lot of times when we talk about things like coal, we're like, oh, coal is ruining the environment, you're killing everyone, and telling people that their job, which to them is how they put food on the table, is killing other people is not a great angle. So shifting that narrative is also important, like recognizing the fact that these things, while they may be destroying the environment, are also how they survive, and so making sure to be kind of respectful of that as we shift.
We're a couple minutes over, but I just want to ask you, maybe we can end on a positive note. Let's see here. Most of this has been pretty positive today. What is your hope for the future? What's your hope in terms of finding common ground around these issues? I mean, how do we get there? What does that look like?
Young people. I've kind of haven't given up on the older generation or my generation, but I do think that the key to changing everything is by turning young people into like educated and mobilized voters and advocates, teaching them how to have engaging conversations with people who disagree with them so that their views are shaped by other people and they shape other people's views, making them understand the significance of these issues and empowering them for change, because it's their future that we're screwing up. And so helping to empower them like that, I think, is key. And also making sure that, like, my main hope is that a lot of times the people who say climate change isn't real and who deny environmental policies and all of those things, those are often the people in power, but they don't actually reflect who their constituents are. And so making sure that constituents are relentlessly year-round advocating for these issues, not just when they're blowing up in the news, that they're constantly pressuring their politicians, no matter what side of the aisle they're on, to create change. That's my hope for the future, that it's very clear to politicians that if you don't do something about climate change, if you don't make this part of your platform, if you don't craft environmental policies, we're going to like continue to yell at you and embarrass you on social media and ultimately vote you out. Like that's my kind of hope that we can mobilize.
Yeah, I'd say like my hope for the future is like my hope for the next year, which is that we need to stop vilifying each other, because that is the biggest problem, in my opinion, to our country right now, or the biggest issue and the biggest danger, because I think we're heading towards a track of like being further and further away from each other as individuals. And I don't think like the people in this room who are liberal and conservative actually hate each other, but we're like being told and convinced to hate each other. And I think that's a really dangerous proposition. I think that the vilifying of conservatives by liberals and liberals by conservatives is a really bad idea. I think the media and the leaders of both parties are to blame for that, because they're kind of making it seem like that's the case. But A, nothing is going to get done when that's the case, and B, it just polarizes us as people and makes us a more angry population. I mean, these riots and there's like Milo came to speak at UW. If you don't know who he is, he's just very controversial. And there was a shooting, at the event, and that stuff is happening more and more and more because people are so polarized, and I think that's a really, really dangerous thing for this country. So I think that's my hope, is that we can bring together people over issues like this, where we can have a dialogue, and I think in America we have the potential to easily move past this. We just have to, as communities and as people, kind of separate the media from the reality and start to get along with each other and have those conversations with each other.
Great. Before we thank both of our speakers, just a couple quick announcements. There is a reception if you'd like to stick around, chat with our speakers, with one another, just outside the doors here, and there's coffee and cookies out there. If you want to stay up to date on future events like this, you can follow the Institute on the Environment or Ensia on social media. Visit us online to sign up for our newsletters too. That's a great way to stay abreast on what's coming up. So thank you very much to both of our speakers.
Can I say one other thing?
One other thing, sure.
Vote.
Vote.
True.
Like, find out where your polling place is today and vote. Even if the election is a gimme in your state, it doesn't matter. Vote.
Agreed.
That's a good place to end it. Thanks to both of you.
Thank you, guys.